So, I'm Mike. I'm here with David Ellerman. We'll be talking about the human rental contract. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your background, your experience?
Okay, I'm trained as a philosopher, economist, and worked many years on worker cooperatives and did a lot of writing on the theory behind it. And so a lot of my writings are excerpted on the website, Abolishing Human Rentals. And so this video is to sort of explain some of the ideas. So the first idea that people ask about when they sort of see the website is, why do you say human rental? What's that? That aren't people hired? And so the first concept you have to sort of explain is that the hiring of a person and renting a person are basically the same thing, that we have this sort of linguistic habit of talking about hiring people but renting cars or renting apartments. But the economic relationship is the same, that you have, you could buy a car, you can buy an apartment, or in slavery times you could buy a person, but when you rent it, you're only buying a segment of their services, renting the car for a day or buying apartment services for a month or something. And the same thing in the hiring relationship, the employment contract, you're basically renting a person or hiring a person for a fixed period of time. And it's just as you decide where to drive the car, you decide where to tell a person to work, and that's the management role of the employer, telling the employee what to do. So that's the, we use the word rental sort of to try to get people to think anew about these questions, because everybody's used to the word hiring, and it's the same word. Even in England, we talk about rental cars here, but if you go to England, they talk about hire cars, and it's the same concept, just what you're linguistically used to. So the name human rentals is trying to get people to think anew, but it's about the employment relationship, the whole relationship where you employ another person, or you hire another person, or you rent another person, and it's all the same thing where you're buying their labor services essentially as a commodity that now you own and you can command. And so the argument is there's something inherently wrong with this contract, and this perplexes people because they've been taught that the whole problem of slavery, for example, owning other people, was it was involuntary, and slavery is almost like, by definition, involuntary. So how could we make an argument that this contract was wrong when it's voluntary and the other is involuntary? And the answer to that is not that the hard labor contract is really involuntary. That's an argument some people make, but is basically nonsense. The argument is that there can be things inherently wrong with the voluntary contract, like the voluntary contract to sell oneself into slavery, which was an actual contract. And historically, very little slavery can be accounted for that, but the intellectual foundation for slavery and the more sophisticated defenses was that slavery was based on an implicit contract. So if you get 18 years of food, clothing, shelter from the master when you're born a slave, you've got to work that off. It's like working off a debt. And of course, as you continue to work it off, you continue to get food, clothing, shelter, as it were, from the master. And so it's one of these like debt peonage. So you had this like debt peonage interpretation of it being an implicit contract. And that was one method of becoming a slave. Another method of becoming a slave was you were a prisoner of war, and this is in Roman law. And you can plea bargain, because if you're a prisoner of war, then you can be killed. And it's like you committed a capital crime by fighting against Rome, and they can kill you, but you can plea bargain that into a lifetime of slavery. And so it's a nasty contract, but it's a nasty choice and so forth. And then there's an explicit contract. So in Roman law, which is the foundation of all Western jurisprudence, you had these three ways of becoming a slave: the explicit contract, plea bargaining from being a prisoner of war, becoming a slave, and then being born a slave and getting the master providing your food, clothing, shelter for 18 years in return for your services, and have to pay that off, as it were, when you become old enough to do useful work for the master. So, in the whole history of abolitionist thought, the abolitionist thought wasn't arguing against involuntary slavery. Nobody really defended involuntary slavery. The argument was, what's wrong with a voluntary slavery contract? Because that's what the sophisticated defense of slavery was. It was one of these three types of implicit or explicit contracts. So there's a whole theory about what can be wrong with a voluntary slavery contract. And those are outlawed. That was outlawed at the same time that slavery was abolished after the Civil War, and is now an invalid contract, no matter how voluntary it is. And you get certain philosophers like libertarian Robert Nozick that said, well, we should allow that contract, allow people to sell themselves, not to mention just rent themselves. So what I tried to do was to go back to that tradition and find the traditional arguments against the contract to sell oneself. And it turned out there is a whole tradition that actually addressed that and developed a theory as to what was wrong with that contract. And the theory turns out also to apply to the renting contract, and that's what made it sort of a more radical theory. So let me outline that theory, what it says. So basically the idea is you have a contract that says, I will take the legal role of a non-person, the beast of burden, say. And or another contract like this, which I should mention, is the old style marriage contract called the coverture marriage contract, where the woman says, I will give up my independent legal personality to become your wife, and I'll take on your last name, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll move from the cover of the father to the cover of the husband. So I'll never be a femme sole, an independent woman. I'll be the sort of a secondary creature that cannot own property or cannot sign contracts in my own name, but only as the extension of the husband. So that contract is also a voluntary contract for centuries. That's also been abolished, and now you can only get married under the sort of partnership contract. And you don't have to give up your independent legal personality. So we have two types of contracts that are pretty well known, that are both abolished, and the one that remains is this rental contract, the employment contract. So what are the arguments? Well, the argument is that if you, either one of these contracts, you have a perfectly adult, rational person making a contract to take a legal role of either a non-person or a like a person that doesn't have full capacity, like a child, or someone that cannot own property or make contracts in their own name. But you're still, the woman that got married was a perfectly adult woman, and the people that made the slavery contract were perfectly normal people. So they can actually fulfill the contract. They can actually become a thing voluntarily. They can actually become a de facto child. But the law said if you obey your master, obey your husband, or obey your master if you're a slave, then you will count that as fulfilling the contract. So it's a perfectly good contract that the master does something for you, pays you to become a slave, or the husband provides you with this or that, and then you obey your so you never actually fill the legal role. You never actually become a non-person or a diminished person, diminished capacity. But the law says you fulfill the contract, therefore we will legally enforce that. And so you cannot own property in your own name because that's what was in the contract, and you cannot be responsible for your actions because you're just a slave or whatever. So the basic theory was that the contract is like an institutional fraud. It's where you say you will voluntarily take on a legal role that you can never actually do, but the legal institutions will play along with the game and will count you as if you were a non-person, or count you as if you were a person of diminished capacity, as long as you obey the master. When you step outside and don't obey the master, then you become a person again. So when the slaves committed crimes, then no longer they were instruments, then they could be charged by the law for murder or whatever it was, and the same with women when they committed crimes. So the sort of fiction that was involved, we're going to play like you're not a person, was there all along. It was, and it turns out the same thing, all that same fiction holds in the employment contract. It's just a shorter term, where I'm not buying you lock, stock, and barrel. I'm buying so many of your services for 8 hours a day or whatever the duration is, but it's the same idea, that when you work as a employee, you don't own anything you produce. You're not liable for any of the cost of the materials that you use up. You're simply seen as a provider of this service. So you're getting like the rental fee, the wage paid to you, and you have no responsibility, as if you're an instrument. I mean, even the language says you're an employee, you're employed by the employer, as if you were an instrument being used by the employer, and the employer was acting through you to produce the product instead of you producing their product. And in fact, you never actually give up your human status. You're just as much de facto responsible for the product in both the positive and the negative, using up the various things that are the cost in an enterprise and producing the product that you sell for revenue in an enterprise. But you have none of that legal responsibility, because legally, as long as you obey the master, then you're just an employee. You're just a provider of this input to the activities of the master that then is employing your labor along with these other things to produce the product, as it were, as the fiction. And the fiction is exposed in the same way when the employee and the employer commit a crime. See, then suddenly the law says, well, there's no more we have this fiction which we're now going to throw away, and we're going to say you were two responsible people that together committed this crime, so you're partners. And